Hello, welcome to Recovery Demystified, a show where we explore our relationship to substances from a radical, non-religious, and empowering lens. Our sobriety is not a purity contract. It is an invitation to become curious about ourselves and find our own unique paths to growth and healing. If you've been questioning the role of alcohol or drugs in your life and haven't found the resources that you need, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello. Welcome back to Recovery Demystified. My name's Early. I'm so happy to have y'all here today. Today on the podcast, I'm going to be sharing with you 3 books, a podcast, and a YouTube channel that I think could support you potentially in your recovery. As I've said over and over in my own recovery, what saved my life was books and podcasts, basically. I really am interested in self-help and science-based resources. I'm really interested in the neuroscience of addiction and how different things like nutrition affect your brain and blah, 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 and all of that stuff. And for me, learning about all of this was really empowering. And I was able to take different tips and tricks and implement them in my life and slowly build a really awesome reservoir of recovery resources for myself. And yeah, so I constantly now am just consuming things like that, different self-help books and books about addiction and recovery and podcasts and YouTube channels and things of the sort. And I'm just constantly filtering through them and sharing the ones that I think are worthwhile with y'all. Something really funny actually happened in that regard recently. I think I got my first book in the mail that was written by AI. I've been trying to find good books about quitting weed because it's become apparent at our support groups that a lot of people are struggling with their use of weed and not really talking about it because we get told oh, you can't be addicted to weed, or it's just a medicinal plant. And it can both be a medicinal plant and something that a person has a very bad problem with that they would like to address in their lives. So I like to hold both of those truths at the same time. But yeah, I got this book in the mail, and first off, I opened it and it just the layout and the font size and just how small the book was. I was oh, you really stretched your few paragraphs to try to make them into a book. And then as I started reading, it was just full of typos and nonsense, and it was just so disjointed. And I was oh shit, is this someone said AI write me a book on quitting weed, and they didn't even edit it, and they just somehow printed a bunch of them self-published. But it was comical how bad it was. So I'm pretty anti-AI. I really like the natural world and the natural creativity of humans, and yeah, some things about what is going on in technology, it does not thrill me. It kind of grosses me out, actually. So getting that book, I was at least it's kind of funny how bad it is. Anyway, today I have 3 books written by human beings to share with y'all. The first one is Alcohol Problems in Native America, The Untold Story of Resistance and Recovery, The Truth About the Lie. And this is by Don L. Coyes and William L. White. And it is one of the books that is published and distributed by White Bison Inc., which is an Indigenous run nonprofit. And they focus on what they call as wellbriety, which is not just sobriety. It's also being well in sobriety. And they also look at the history of colonization and ancestral trauma and how the inherited intergenerational trauma created addiction issues that we see in Native communities in North America today. And this book is really great because it talks about first the myths of alcohol use within Indigenous communities, and then it talks about the resistance that's been going on for hundreds of years within Indigenous communities, and things like the Handsome Lake tradition and the Church of Peyote and things like that. And it's really well researched. There's a ton of references and footnotes. And it's also really easy to read. It's not super academic whatsoever. It's just pretty readable, and it covers so many topics. I have not ever found a book quite like this, and I want to read a couple of clips out of it because it's so good. First is an entry about firewater myths, The firewater myths served a number of important functions. They helped establish and maintain systems of domination and subjugation by reinforcing views of European superiority and native inferiority. 2. Reduced moral culpability of Euro-Americans by masking the larger political, economic, and cultural conditions out of which native alcohol problems arose and were sustained. 3. Buttressed the definition of manifest destiny, controlling all lands discovered between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans by defining native people as subhuman. 4. Provided ideological justification for preemptive assaults upon the enforced isolation of native communities. And 5. Justified a wide range of invasive social control measures within Indian country. Words and ideas are important weapons of conquest, subjugation, and extermination. If you want to care for something, you call it a flower. If you want to kill something, you call it a weed. The firewater myths were part of a larger process of dehumanization that rendered native peoples a weed in the eyes of Euro-Americans. And then the next entry that I want to read, this book is so good. I wish I could just read the whole thing aloud to y'all. The next entry that I want to read is the sort of the concept of wellbriety and cultural healing as a method towards Indigenous folk response to addiction. And it says, culturally informed treatment seeks to understand the wounded individual in the context of historical and continued wounding of the native tribal culture of which he or she is a part. It recognizes that, as the Red Road to Wellbriety teaches, healthy seeds cannot grow in diseased soil. It seeks not just the healing of the individual, but the healing of the community within which that individual is nested. As such, the goal of culture-congenial alcoholism treatment is viewed as a restoration of harmony between the individual, the family, the tribe, and the world. In contrast to interventions grounded in Western medicine, it is more holistic, more focused on creating a better person in the context of family and clan than on symptom suppression. And I think that that's really just like amazing and beautiful to have this realization that the colonization and the trauma is what fed and caused a lot of the addiction issues, and that the response to that is reconnecting back to cultural roots and community. And yeah, I just think that that's a really beautiful idea. And later in the book, there is a section that says recovery, revitalization, and decolonization. And it says a significant milestone in decolonization is the development of language and ideas within native cultures to describe the individual and collective problems that resulted from cultural domination. The religious and cultural revitalization movements described in these pages offered their own understandings and interventions into alcohol and other drug-related problems. These movements conveyed to subjugated people that they had a right to exist, to be seen as they chose to present themselves, and have their experiences and problems expressed in words and stories of their own creation. These words and stories conveyed a singular message. Cultural enmeshment and cultural identity constitute protective shields against instruments of healing for alcohol and other drug-related problems among Native peoples, a proposition that is finding increased support in scientific literature. And then the last little section that I bookmarked here is towards the end, and it says, the story of destructive effects of alcohol and alcoholism among Native peoples has often been noted, but this is a tale filled with mistruths that served and continue to serve particular cultural and political interests. We've tried to deconstruct some of these misconceptions while acknowledging the devastating role alcohol has played in the history of many Native tribes. But most importantly, we have sought to convey that this story is not one of passive injury, but instead one of active and prolonged resistance and recovery. There are continual voices of Native recovery from the early woodland prophetic traditions of the 18th century through the 19th century messianic movements of the Trans-Mississippi region to 20th century sobriety-based cultural revitalization movements and the rising wellbriety movement. This book is just so fucking excellent because we talk about decolonization in a lot of different aspects, but I've just never seen a book that does this so well with the history of alcohol use and colonization specifically. Yeah, I just can't speak highly enough about the books by White Bison Inc. They're comprehensive. They are very well researched. They're easy to read. And it is a historical perspective that we often get the wrong story. And the perspective of Indigenous resistance is suppressed and overlooked. And I'm just so grateful that I found these books by White Bison Inc. And I'm really happy to be able to provide them to folks in our community. Any of the books that I talk about on the podcast, or if you find another book that is about like healing or addiction or something of that nature, we have a fund for our free book project. So if you want any of these books, just send an email to us, info@recoverydemystified.com, and I'm super happy to buy them for you. And it's really important, a part of the mission at Recovery Demystified, to be able to provide culturally appropriate resources to people and also to serve historically marginalized communities. So if you're Native and you want one of these books, like, I'm fucking stoked to be able to buy it for you. So yeah, just let me know. The next book I had picked out is No Bad Parts: Healing Trauma and Restoring Wholeness with the Internal Family Systems Model by Richard Schwartz. And this book, so I don't remember what month it was, but I also reviewed Rational Recovery by Jack Trimpey, which goes over the concept of addicted voice recognition technique and being able to see your thoughts as not all being your own. And it was one of the most important books that I'd ever read while I was trying to escape from my addiction. The idea that, so I know this happens a lot to probably all of us, where, like, for instance, say you wake up in the morning hungover and you're like, oh, I'm never going to drink again. And then the exact same day, a few hours later, you find yourself at the liquor store. And having two different thoughts in your mind simultaneously that conflict with one another is called cognitive dissonance. And when I learned that that was like a thing, it totally blew my mind. And I was like, oh my God, I'm not just crazy for having these conflicting thoughts, and there's a word for it. And then I learned that addicted voice recognition technique through Jack Trimpey's book, Rational Recovery. And it was a fucking game changer for me in my recovery, being able to separate myself from the addicted voice and view the addicted voice from my core self, and be able to realize that I don't have to listen to those thoughts. It's no longer I want a drink, it's the addicted voice wants a drink. And learning that skill was just earth-shattering and was extremely important in my ability to be able to recover. And I'm super well practiced in negotiating and speaking with the addicted voice. And as the years went on, it gets quieter and quieter and quieter. It still pipes up once in a while. And it's like just kind of funny when it does now. I'm like, hey, bud, we're not going to do that, right? Like, good try. But last summer, I totally forget who recommended this book to me. Maybe a therapist, or, oh, I think it was a friend, a very dear friend. So anyway, a friend recommended this book to me, and I read it when I was staying in a hotel and actually doing peer support specialist training, which is a free training where they paid for me to have a hotel, and I went to Little Rock, and it's like addiction coach kind of training, but from like a peer support modality, where people who have been through addiction that are now recovered get this training, and then they are able to help people who are currently struggling. And the training was pretty challenging for me. I don't know, but being neurodivergent in a classroom setting full of strangers in a different city was, it was a bit much, but I did learn a lot of really good skills from that class, and I'm super grateful it was free, and I was really happy to be able to do that. But during my off time, I was reading this book, No Bad Parts, in the hotel room, and it is basically like the concept of recognizing the addicted voice, but times a zillion. The thought here is like, anytime we experience trauma in our lives that's unprocessed, that becomes a part of us that gets stuck inside of our psyche. And that part of us might offer us thoughts or speak or try to control our actions at certain times. And most of us just go throughout life letting the inner child or whatever just take the reins. But the concept of internal family systems is turning that flashlight inwards on our psyche and viewing all of the different parts that are in there. There's like protector parts, and there's firefighter parts, and there's, I forget what word they use to refer to the traumatized part. But yeah, it's like learning how to view and listen and respect all of the different parts that are inside of us. And it was really hard for me to read this book because I had these protector parts that were so convinced, they're like, we have this all in order here. Like, we've got everything taken care of. You don't need to be in here fucking rocking the boat. And talking to my therapist about my experience of like reading this book and experiencing really strong emotional and thought reactions to the contents of it was, it was a challenging time. And then I did internal family systems therapy with a therapist for a little over a year and made a lot of progress. But in the end, the protector protector parts just were sort of shutting it down. But at this point, I understand the concepts of internal family systems well enough that I can implement it in my life when things come up. Like when I have unreasonable reactions to stuff, I can turn the gaze inwards and be like, oh, is this a part? Like, what part of me is this? And what is a concern? And basically, it's just made me better at listening to my own thoughts instead of just impulsively reacting and believing everything that I think. So I think it's a really good book just to get like a primer on the concept of internal family systems. But I do think it's something that is important to work with a professional on because, yeah, this book, reading it was so fucking triggering and super emotional for me. It's a great concept. It's a wonderful modality for doing trauma therapy, and it's something to look into. So that's why I would recommend No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz. And then the last book that I wanted to talk about this month is How to Do the Work, Recognize Your Patterns, Heal from Your Past, and Create Yourself by Dr. Nicole LePera, who apparently is famous on the internet as the holistic psychologist. But if you've been listening to me for a while, you know that I have not had any social media since I deleted Facebook in 2010. And it was like one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. So I'm not up to date on any real internet drama or anything like that. But apparently she's got drama with people calling her out for, you know, being a wealthy white woman who's not addressing institutionalized racism adequately, or like the conflict with Israel and Palestine, or something of that nature. Someone told me that people have criticisms of her for that, which rightfully so. However, I can hold multiple truths at once and understand that it's always important to definitely like encourage and hold people who are in positions of power, wealthy white folks, to higher standards, and always encourage them to do better. And also understand that she is doing good work and that this book is valuable and that she has like a lot of interesting, innovative, loving things to say. And a lot of the stuff in this book is stuff I'm already familiar with, but one of the things that really stood out to me is ego stories. And she goes over a lot of different stuff in here. There is, the concept of mind-body, which I don't know why people think your brain and your body are separate. Obviously, they're connected. Your brain is there inside of your body and your mind is there inside of your brain. So like, obviously, trauma lives in your body, and the things that you eat are going to affect how your emotions feel. You know what I mean? So that's not a new concept for me. And I'm like, it's kind of shocking for me that that is even like a normative thought within society, that the brain and the body are separate. But anyway, she talks about mind-body healing, trauma in your body, inner child work, trauma bonds, boundaries, emotional maturity, reparenting. The one that stood out for me personally was ego stories. And these are things like concepts that we have about ourselves, like I'm easily overlooked, or it's easy to cancel plans with me, or I'm this, that, or the other thing. Just different phrases that we tell ourselves that can be based on like traumatic things that happened when we were kids. And I'm learning to see certain ego stories that I have and beginning to question them because of this book. And also, I'm still so obsessed with attachment theory because I have anxious attachment, and I've been working through it for the past few years. So whenever anyone's talking about attachment theory, I'm like, yes, like I'm eating it up. And I just want to read a couple paragraphs from here regarding that. She says, for many of us, our particular cycle of closeness and rejection began in infancy as a part of our earliest relationships. So we are compelled to find adult relationships that mirror this conditioned cycle. In childhood, this can look like a parent figure who is inconsistent in expressing love, showing attention at one moment and complete lack of interest at another. We crave love, so our child brains learned how to adapt. If our parent figures gave us attention when we misbehaved, even negative attention, we may have purposefully acted out in order to receive more attention. This may not seem as though we're getting our needs met, though we're receiving attention and being seen, core needs in childhood. Our childhood attempts to have our physical, emotional, and spiritual needs met by our parent figures, however incomplete, impersonal, or even self-betraying they may be, form the basis of how we meet those same needs in adult relationships. We gravitate towards familiar dynamics regardless of the outcome. It's no wonder then that children born into environments filled with stress and chaos will seek similar environments as adults. When we exist in a state of fear, of physical harm, sexual abuse, or abandonment, our body is altered on molecular, neurochemical, and physiological levels. The feeling we get from the release of stress hormones and our nervous system response can become addictive if we're conditioned to associate them with the experience of love. This becomes homeostasis right down to the firing and wiring of our neural pathways in our brain. We are always subconsciously seeking to relive our past because we are creatures of comfort who love to be able to predict the future, even if that future is certain to be painful, miserable, or even terrifying. It's safer than the unknown. And that last little bit really reminds me of addiction and how a lot of times we get stuck in addiction subconsciously because our mind finds it easy to be able to predict the future, even if the future contains guaranteed suffering, which it will in continued addiction. And that's why a lot of times when we seek to create something new and different in our lives, there's a part of our brain that's like, no, don't change. Or it just psychologically prevents us from trying to do something new because the brain wants to seek the familiar. So anyway, that entry really stuck with me. And I think this book is really great. No Bad Parts and How to Do the Work both are not specifically about addiction, but you hear me say all the time, everything's connected, and we don't just have an addiction because everything else in our life is perfect. So I think in recovery, it's important to try to peel back the layers of the onion and dig into ourselves and figure out where the trauma is at and what other emotional reactions aren't serving us, and find different ways to heal and grow and learn that will foster a positive environment for us to continue on without using addictive substances. So that is why I chose those two books. And I've been listening to this podcast that a friend sent to me, and let's see here. And at first I was like, oh, this person is just an obnoxious new age hippie, and it really bothered me. But the more I listened to it, the more I got into it. So it's called Holistic Life Navigation Podcast by Luis Mojica. And what I really like about this podcast is he talks about the connection between food, nutrition, and healing stress and trauma, which I'm on this new kick of, I was talking about earlier, the mind-body connection, where of course we all have to negotiate with the difficult thoughts in our minds and cravings and stuff like that. But perhaps if we treat our bodies in a healthier way, that the issues that we have psychologically with our emotions could become much more manageable. And Luis has so many different episodes about things just like beans. How beans can help grow your microbiome, and how your microbiome creates 50% of your dopamine and 95% of your serotonin. And so if you eat beans and your microbiome grows, you can literally have more happy chemicals in your brain. And it's just amazing to think about a bean or a food having such a profound effect on our psychology. And it makes sense. And there's a lot of information about the modern diet and how it causes inflammation and the effects that inflammation has on just fucking everything. And yeah, there's 300 episodes, and they're okay. So speaking of dualities and holding multiple truths at once, Luis Mojica has some opinions that I do not agree with. And I don't think that necessarily needs to detract from the fact that I do deeply enjoy the episodes that are about food and nutrition and healing stress and trauma. Some things that I really actually enjoy about when he gets into difficult subjects are that he's really open with his story about being intersex, and that he's really open with his story about being bisexual. He's really open with his story about being a victim of sexual abuse. And those are three things that people just don't talk that much about, especially being intersex. 2% of the population is intersex, which means 1 in 50 people. And I literally cannot think of another person in the public eye in a position of power who just super openly and candidly talks about their experiences being intersex. And so I am just I very much appreciate him for that. But also he uses his experiences of being intersex to have these really strong opinions about transgender people, and I don't agree with his opinions, but his opinions are also rooted in love. So I'm just like, okay, it's okay. It's okay to have different opinions, you know. He also talks about radical rehumanization in a way that I don't talk about it. You know, sometimes people dehumanize themselves by being hateful and violent, and I just don't really need to take the time and energy to radically rehumanize people. Like I've got shit to do. I mean, if we could radically rehumanize like homeless people instead of the type of people that he's talking about, I'd be down for that. But I'm not trying to radically rehumanize Nazis. So yeah, he's got, if you get to looking in the backlog, not every episode is a winner. And yeah, he's got some opinions that I do not share. But yeah, the ones about food and nutrition and stress and trauma are pretty great. And I love beans, and I'm glad that he gave me a fucking free license to love beans. So super appreciate him for that. Super appreciate him for a few other things. And then also I'm like, at least I'm fucking mature enough to be like, if you don't share 100% of my opinions, but your opinions are still rooted in love and acceptance, even if they're different from mine, we're cool, you know? Like, it's chill. But if you get into the backlog and you see some of his episode titles and you're like, wow, Early recommended this guy, that's why. Okay. Anywho, I am always looking for more podcast recommendations. I am just, the well is dry on that. So if you know me, or if you don't, send it in the email. You know, if you know good podcasts that I should listen to and talk about, let me know, because I'm just low-key burned out on it. Anywho, the last recovery resource that I wanted to share is a YouTube channel called Put the Shovel Down, and that's by Amber Hollingsworth. And a little teaser for you, I'm actually interviewing her for next week's episode, and I'm interviewing her tomorrow, and I'm like low-key sort of nervous because I've only ever interviewed just normal people in recovery. I've never interviewed a medical professional with the fucking YouTube following of 750,000 people or whatever, so we'll see how that turns out. But anyway, I think her YouTube channel is great. She has a lot of videos about like the science of addiction and how it's like a predictable process. And she talks a lot about, her main focus honestly is being a support person, like advice for support people who love someone who's in addiction. She talks about like how to create healthy boundaries, and the things that we're doing are accidentally putting us in the bad guy role when we're trying to help people, and then what are like things you can do instead that are actually helpful for a person in addiction. And that's why I'm excited to interview her, because that is something that I never really understood how to do, like specific, like from a data informed standpoint. So I'm excited for that. She has just an absolute shit ton of videos on YouTube, and from what I've seen, the majority of them are pretty great. So yeah, if you're interested in like the science of addiction, or if you're interested in how to be supportive of someone with an addiction while maintaining your own sanity, like while creating healthy boundaries for yourself that allow you to have that space to support someone, she's got a ton of absolutely free information on YouTube about that. So that is why I would recommend Put Down the Shovel, the YouTube channel by Amber Hollingsworth. Wow, and look at that, y'all. I sat there and talked again for 30 minutes. How do I do it? It's autistic special interest. That's how I do it. Cool. Okay. Well, yeah. Send me your recommendations for podcasts. Send me feedback in the email. And if you are struggling today, I want you to know that you are doing a great job, because you're surviving. And I'm really proud of you for listening all the way through. And I hope you get something out of this. And I love you. And if I can recover, anyone can. So with that, I bid you farewell. May you be happy and free. Recovery Demystified is produced and edited by me, Early Brunner. Stevie Pettit made our logo. Our social media manager is Kaylee Bausch. Logan Bragg wrote our beautiful theme music. We are entirely supported by donations as a 501c3 nonprofit. Your tax-deductible donations can be made to our Venmo or to our PayPal at Recovery Demystified. May you be happy and free, dear listener.